I'm Owen Rees. I'm the Fellow in Music at Queen's, and I'm also the Director of Music at Queen's, a post that the college calls College Organist, which means that I direct the college choir. I've just published a book on one of the most famous pieces of Renaissance sacred music, which is by the Spanish composer Victoria, and it's his six-voice requiem that he composed right at the start of the 17th century. And in modern times, it's become a very famous work, particularly in performance. So there are dozens of recordings of the piece, and yet there wasn't any extended study of it. I was writing this book for a series called Music in Context, which looks at a major work and places it in its historical context, in the context of its genesis. For Victoria's Requiem, we know a lot about that genesis. It was composed in the period of just 2 or 3 weeks following the death of his patron, Maria, the Dowager Empress of Austria. And she lived in a convent, a royal convent in Madrid in retirement, close to the royal palace. And he was one of her chaplains. So on her death, early in 1603, he had about 2 or 3 weeks to compose this piece, which was sung at her exequies, the great funeral services for the empress in the convent. So the book looks at this context of how exequies happened, what the music for them was like in Habsburg Spain in the late 16th and 17th centuries. But I also took the opportunity to explore what turns out to be a vast, pretty much unknown repertory internationally of requiem masses from that period, the late 16th and early 17th centuries, particularly in Italy. I work on music in the Iberian Peninsula and in England from the late 15th century to the early 17th century. And most of what I work on is sacred music and sacred musical culture in that period. So the Spanish composers that I've worked on and published on include, besides Victoria, his most famous predecessors among Spanish polyphonists of that period, who are Francisco Guerrero, who was the director of music at Seville Cathedral for many decades in the second half of the 16th century. So one of Spain's 2 wealthiest and musically most important cathedrals in that period. And his teacher, Cristobal de Morales, who was born around about the start of the 16th century and taught Guerrero when Morales was briefly director of music at the other most important cathedral in Spain at that period, which is Toledo. And then the other half of what I do as a musicologist concerns Tudor England. So the same sort of period. And I've worked, for example, on the music of William Byrd. In a couple of years, we're coming up to a nice round number anniversary for Byrd. So there's going to be a lot more work on William Byrd coming up over the next couple of years. I think for work on early modern sacred music, as for a lot of early music, one of the great debates is whether we should be looking narrowly at works, or indeed whether the concept of a great musical work was particularly relevant in that period in musical culture. And so there's been a lot of vigorous challenges to this traditional focus on, if you like, the dots, on the music itself and on the work concept, and a lot more emphasis on music as performed, on music as ephemeral and reflecting the circumstances of a particular performance, music as malleable in those senses. And so there's quite a lot being published on what is usually being called soundscapes, trying to recapture the rich and broad soundscape, not just the elite music of an early modern city, if you like. So the equivalent of the cityscape is the sounds of those streets and the churches and the palaces, and music in domestic circumstances in people's homes. And that, I suppose, ties into one aspect of the so-called new musicology, which is now not very new. It started in the late 70s and early 80s, around about the time, or just before I was an undergraduate. And that's one main effort of the new musicology has been to contextualize, to understand this music, not narrowly, and not, if you like, simply as the work of great dead white men, but to broaden out in all kinds of ways, in a way to take a more ethnomusicological approach to those musical cultures. One of the things I'm looking forward to most as a performer and somebody who records music for voices is the opportunity to carry on exploring repertoire that's not very well known. So the project I've just finished with my small professional ensemble, Contrapunctus, is a 3 CD series looking at the greatest single manuscript source of Tudor music from the Elizabethan period, which was copied by somebody called John Baldwin, who was a singing man at St George's Windsor Castle. And he was a musical antiquarian in part, so he copied music that was decades and decades old by then. But also, he was a great fan of his musical contemporaries, particularly William Byrd. So we get a very broad, almost a history of the last several decades of sacred music in England in this one set of books. It involves some reconstruction because it's a set of part books, and we've lost the tenor book. The rest survive in Christchurch Library. And so part of my task before recording that music was to do reconstructions of that missing tenor voice for some of the repertoire. But I particularly enjoy digging out less well known and less frequently recorded or not yet recorded repertoire. So we have various projects in store, including some projects to do with Portuguese music, which is another of the musicological centres, if you like, of my research. And so there's a 17th century composer from Portugal who worked in one of the great convents in Portugal, whose music has been on the edge of becoming well known through some performances in recent years, but has yet to hit, if you like, the recording studio in any serious way. What I particularly enjoy in my role at Queen's is, of course, looking after the academic side of the music, but also the interchange between that and the performance and cultural side of the college. If you like, the times when the college opens its doors and that we pack the chapel for a concert, or that we reach out for wider audiences through broadcasts or on tour with the choir in the UK and abroad. And another aspect of that work within the college is that it draws together, of course, undergraduates and postgraduates from the whole range of academic subjects. So it's one aspect of the college that's very interdisciplinary, and it allows me the opportunity to work regularly, not just with the music students, therefore, but with students reading all kinds of different subjects at Queen's.